Right, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you very much for joining the webinar today. We hope you'll find this of real interest to you. Today's webinar is the launch of SDN's first Environmental Performance Index. This is our first attempt to develop a comparison of oil and gas company performance in the Niger Delta with respect to the environment. It's 2018 because that's the year for which we are able to get the latest data. So again, thank you for joining today. Just to make you all aware, we are recording today's webinar. We will share the slides, a recording of this webinar, and links to the brief and report after today's event, so you'll get access to all of those things. My name's Calvin Ling. I'm Programs Director, SDN. Other hosts today are Jesse Martins-Manifold, Senior Project Officer at SDN, based in Port Harcourt in Rivers State in the Niger Delta, and Kevin McCann, Senior Research and Policy Officer, who works with me in the London SDN office in the UK. Just a couple of sort of housekeeping things before we go further. If you do drop off at any point and need to rejoin Zoom, if you can't hear us, it might be because there's been a problem with you rejoining the audio. So look out for the button down the bottom left you can see there to rejoin the audio. And the way that we'll be handling discussion today is via the chat box, which you can see at the bottom there. You're welcome to add messages as we go through the presentation, but we'll have a question and answer discussion at the end. Please keep yourselves on mute, and also to avoid turning your video on, please, whilst we go through the webinar today. In terms of the agenda, well, I will say a quick piece about SDN, and then I will hand over to my colleague Kevin, who will take you through the Environmental Performance Index, what it is and what it tells us. This will all take, I think, about 30 minutes, and then the rest of the webinar will be open for discussion, questions from yourselves. We've set the sort of finish time at 3 p.m, but if we still have a lot of questions coming in at that point, we'll be happy to continue for a bit longer. So moving on to the next slide, and the next one. So many of you are probably already familiar with SDN. We are a Port Harcourt-based civil society organisation. We've worked in the Niger Delta for over 15 years with those that are affected by issues of governance in the Niger Delta and the impact of the oil and gas sector in the region. I want to say thank you to the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs who supported this work, but also to note that this work does not necessarily reflect their views, of course. And I also just want to say, in the development of this index, prior to launching today, we've had quite a bit of engagement with the oil and gas industry in Nigeria, and also with the key regulator, the National Oil Spills Detection and Response Agency, who provided feedback on this index, which we've really appreciated, and that's helped us to improve our report. But also I want to acknowledge that we've not necessarily been able to respond to all the issues and concerns that they've raised. This is for a number of reasons, perhaps because we'll have different perspectives on the issues, and perhaps because data doesn't allow us to make further advances to the index at the moment, but also because we hope to continually improve the index over time. So this is our first time doing this. A good example is one issue that was raised is the topic of oil theft and sabotage in the Niger Delta, which we know is a massive problem and a big cause of oil spills. Questions were raised about whether the index is sufficiently accounting for that problem in the Niger Delta or not. And we've tried to respond to that as much as possible in the index and report, but it's something that we'll be looking at in future years as we develop the index further. But the key for us in developing this index is that we've wanted to start a constructive and collaborative discussion on environmental problems in the Niger Delta with the industry, with regulators, with civil society and others, so that we can try and find solution based on a common understanding of the nature and scale of the problem. And we think we've been able to do that. So we're really pleased that we've already been able to start that discussion with the industry and with government. So without further ado, I'll move on and hand over to Kevin, who will take you through the index itself.
Thank you, Calvin. Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
Great. Okay. Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you may be. So my name is Kevin McCann. As Calvin said previously, I'm a Senior Research and Policy Officer at SDN, and I will be taking you through a little bit more about the index itself and what it's all about. And I'll do that in 3 or 4 sections. So first of all, I will just give a little bit of an overview about what it is and why we put it together beyond what Calvin just explained. I'll talk a little bit about the sort of overall key messages that we will be promoting as part of the release of this report. Then I'll take you through in brief the sort of methodology that we use to construct the index. Then I will go through some of our findings in a little bit more detail, looking at some of the sort of key analysis that we've conducted, and then what it all means and what we're hoping to do as a result of the publication of this report, potentially in collaboration with some of the people on this call. So what is the Environmental Performance Index? It's really a snapshot of the environment in the Niger Delta. As many of you will know, there are severe issues with environmental degradation and associated with the oil industry in the Niger Delta. And this is really an attempt to understand the emissions that cause that degradation in more detail than is currently available. So we've looked at the industry overall and its contribution to things such as climate change, but also the contribution of individual companies. And what we've really tried to do is present what can be quite technical data relating to environmental emissions in an accessible format, so that people can understand more about the types of challenges that we work on as an organization. To do that, we've come up with 5 key indicators, which we've used to compare performance among the companies operating in the Niger Delta. And then we've combined these, we've scored companies on these and combined them to create an overall ranking. And that is the index itself, which looks like this. So this is the sort of overall list of companies that we've looked at. And later I will talk you through how we've built up the indicators relating to this overall index. Why have we produced this index? Well, as Calvin said, we want to start a conversation. We are always looking to collaborate in a constructive manner with the various different stakeholders involved in the oil industry in the Niger Delta. And the goal of this index is really to try and create shared value. So as I say, to provide a clear picture overall of the environmental challenges associated with the Nigerian oil industry, and then to use that to inform discussion between civil society organizations like SDN, the government, and of course the industry itself. And that's really with a view to building a collective agenda for change. Our organizational remit is to minimize the impact and maximize the benefit of Nigeria's natural resources. And we want to be able to put together an agenda for how we can do that in the context of broader global goals such as the energy transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy as part of global efforts to mitigate and ideally prevent climate change. So just in terms of sort of the key messages, I think that are the most important things which for us have come out of this report. I think in absolute terms, we would draw attention to the ongoing very high level of pollution in the Niger Delta. Around 25,000 barrels of oil were spilled in 18, which is more than 4 million litres. Nearly 500 billion cubic feet of gas were flared or burnt off as a byproduct of oil production. And that gas flaring volume equates to around 25 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. Now, there are clear local and international consequences to the release of these potentially harmful emissions in terms of the degradation of cropland and water resources on which people survive or depend rather, both for their sort of drinking and bathing water, but also for fishing and their livelihoods. And of course, the contribution to climate change from the release of the carbon dioxide is a very significant issue. I think overall, these releases of environmental emissions compare poorly with other global oil industries. And this index is relative and looks at the performance of companies compared with each other. But the Nigerian industry overall, as I say, does not compare favorably with other regional or national oil industries. And the reason we know this is we have taken the data that we have produced for this report and compared it with the emissions data from the trade body, which is the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. And this shows that on a per unit basis, Nigerian oil spill volumes are 10 times as high and gas flaring volumes are. You can see the dark grey bar on the left-hand side is the quantity of oil spilled per unit of production in Nigeria, and as higher than the average for Africa and for the global average, which is in orange. Similarly, the amount of gas flared per unit of oil produced is also much higher, which are the bars you can see in the graph on the right-hand side. I should note that this is not a direct like-for-like comparison. 2017 International Oil and Gas Producers Association data was the latest available at the time of producing the report, but the discrepancy is clearly very high, as you can see. Sort of make clear is that the majority of
Kevin, I don't know if you've perhaps got some headphones in that you're speaking through. Maybe the connections become a little loose because you're starting to cut in and out a little.
Okay, is that clearer?
It seems to be, yes.
Great, thank you for letting me know. Apologies about that, everybody. So in terms of drilling into the data a little bit more on a sort of company by company level, our analysis shows that the majority of emissions are produced by international companies and the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, which is the Nigerian state-owned oil company. And that's not altogether unexpected, as they have much higher production volumes than other companies. Just over 90% of oil spilled is attributable to the 5 main companies you can see on the slide there: ITEO, the Nigerian Agip Oil Company, Heritage, NNPC, and Nigerian Shell. About 50% of the gas is attributable to ExxonMobil and NNPC. So again, well, half or a majority effectively of the gas flared is attributable to 2 companies. But it's important to note that on a per unit, so relative to the amount of oil produced, it's actually indigenous Nigerian operators which produce higher emissions, so Express Petroleum and Summit Oil, as you can see there. And I think that's important, or that's significant, because anecdotally, local communities sometimes call for oil exploration contracts to be awarded to local companies on the grounds that they have stronger environmental performance, whereas our analysis suggests that this might not be the case. So then just a word on the data. I think the other thing that we really picked up is the degree to which there are differences in source data on Nigerian oil between regulators, between the oil companies, and also other sources. And as a result, this analysis is not definitive. It's indicative based on what's available, data in the public domain. But our assumption is that actual emissions are actually higher for a number of reasons, which are elaborated on in the full report. And this is a challenge because one of the big sort of issues in the Niger Delta is mistrust between local communities, the industry, and government. And this is one of the reasons for which we produced the report, as I said previously, to try and give a clear picture of the different challenges associated with Nigerian oil. And as Calvin mentioned previously, we do intend to include additional analysis in future versions of this work, for example, relating to third-party interference or sabotage, to try and go into some of these discrepancies in a little bit more detail. So a brief word on the methodology of how we put together this report. First of all, we set out to gather data. Most of our data is from various regulators, including the Department of Petroleum Resources and the National Oil Spill Detection and Response Agency. And just to note that the data for this report we used is from 2018, and that's because it was the last complete year for which all relevant data is currently available. So it's as up to date as it can be. Then we built a database to analyze the numbers, And as part of that, we developed a set of indicators to try and compare the companies on a fair basis. We then went through a review process. So a number of other organizations looked at our work and provided us with feedback, which we used to improve the report. And just to note, as Calvin said previously, that of course, this work does not represent their views or policies necessarily. And then we went through the process of industry and regulator engagement. So talking to the companies and NOSDRA about this work and various issues that were raised as part of the research. The database I mentioned, we will be publishing that online. So all graphs, data, calculations are published and fully referenced in the Excel file, which we will be making available. So you'll be free to download that, and you can order companies and look at the statistics according to the sort of indicators we've used and order them as you wish. And the database also includes details of the conversion factors and the other assumptions that we use to build the model. We welcome constructive critique, and as I said, we will be looking to sort of improve future versions of this work, but this is a database that we've used for this version of the report. So in terms of the findings then, in a little bit more detail, I'll now take you through the indicators which we use to interrogate the environmental performance of the Nigerian oil industry. And there are 5 of those indicators. First is the total volume of oil spilled by each company, which has a oil spill volume attributed to it by the regulator. Second is the number of oil spills, which is fairly self-explanatory, but significant because the cumulative impact of many small spills can be significant, as of course can be the impact of one large spill. We also looked at the oil spill removal rate. So when there is a spill, action is usually undertaken to try and contain and remove some of the oil itself. You've got an image on the right-hand side there of the removal of surface land contaminated by an oil spill. And so this affects the total amount, or effectively the net discharge of oil from a particular spill. And it's therefore relevant to understanding the emissions and ultimately the environmental performance of a particular company. We then looked also at the volume of gas flared in 1,000 standard cubic feet, which is the standard or one of the standard industry metrics used to measure gas flare volumes. And finally, we calculated an emissions ratio. Now, this is important to account for the relative size of companies involved in Nigerian oil. So the emissions ratio is calculated in BOE, which is barrels of oil equivalent, the proportion of a company's total annual production volume also emitted in either oil spills or gas flared. So for example, if a company produced 1 million barrels of oil in 2018, and it also produced 100,000 barrels of emissions, either as oil spilled or as gas flared, converted to barrels of oil, then it would have an emissions ratio of 10%. So 10% of its production was also released in potentially harmful environmental emissions. And so the lower the ratio, the better the performance effectively. So in terms of indicator 1, total volume of oil spilled, just to set the scene a little bit by state, you have 6 or 7 main oil producing states in the Niger Delta. And as you can see there very clearly, the majority of oil spilled was in River State, Delta State, and also Bayelsa State. Breaking that down by LGA, which is local government area, the darker the red in this map, the higher the volume of oil spilled. And so there are 2 LGAs we've picked out there, Warri Southwest and Abuja Dual. And collectively, these 2 LGAs alone account for about 1/4 of all oil spilled. So as you can see, there's geographic dispersion among oil spills. And this is one of the things that we will be looking into more in future. Looking at oil spill by company, there were 18 companies in total which spilled oil, according to regulator data in 2018, on average around or nearly 1,500 barrels per year. And as you can see, there's a wide spread there, Shell with around 12,000, and then Heritage, Nigerian Oil Company, ITEO, the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, and some others with smaller amounts towards the right-hand side of the graph. So that's an indication of the different amounts of oil spilled by all the oil companies operating in Nigeria in 2018. Indicator 2 was the cumulative, the cumulative or the total number of oil spills by each company. And what we've done here is we've plotted that using the orange line, which you can see falling sharply from the left-hand side. And we've also included the average spill size by company. And this is just to demonstrate that companies which do spill oil, of course, there are different reasons for why that happens, but the way in which it happens is also different. So you can see on the left-hand side that Nigerian, Shell, ExxonMobil have a relatively high number of spills, but the bar represents the average size of their spills, which is actually smaller than some of the other companies which have a smaller number of spills overall, but the spills themselves are perhaps quite a bit bigger. So this is just to make the point that, as of everything, of course, there are different ways in which environmental emissions are released into the environment, and different reasons for which they take place as well. Our third indicator is the oil spill removal rate. So as I mentioned, when an oil spill first takes place, there is activity, for example, placing floating booms across rivers to try and prevent the spread and facilitate the capture and recovery of crude oil discharge into the environment. And so the gross volume of a spill tends to come down once this initial activity has taken place. So the gray line you can see in the middle of the graph here is a percentage. So that's the amount per company of its total spills, which was subsequently removed. And what this allows you to see is, for example, I hope you can see my cursor, that Heritage here spilled around 4,000 barrels of oil gross, but it had quite a high recovery rate. And so the net amount of oil that remains, presumably in the Niger Delta environment subsequent to this activity, is a lot lower. And so, of course, this is an indicator that is relevant to environmental performance. Our fourth indicator relates to the volume of gas flared. So oil and gas tend to be found in the same geological reserves. To produce the oil, you usually need to flare the gas or burn it off for safety and other reasons. Now, this has been prohibited in Nigeria for several decades. There are legitimate reasons for which it can be flared, relating, for example, to safety or operational concerns, but in general, it shouldn't take place. As you can see, there's also a very large spread here of the volumes of gas being flared by different companies. NNPC is by far the highest on paper, and that's likely a function of the fact that because of the way in which the oil industry is structured, on paper, NNPC is involved with almost oil production in Nigeria. So you can see the average here, and then I think it's 42 companies out of the 43 that we looked at were involved in some form of gas flaring in Nigeria in 2018. Finally then, the emissions ratio. So this is where I mentioned that what we did was to calculate the total volume of oil spilled and gas flared. We then converted that to the barrels of oil equivalent figure, and then worked that out as a percentage of total oil production by a particular company, which allows us to see, in relative terms, adjusting for production volumes, the volume of emissions by companies. Now you can see that there are two very clear outliers here, Express Petroleum and Summit Oil, which I mentioned at the beginning. So what we have done to make it easier to see the relative differences is we have removed those two outliers and then plotted the emissions ratio against total emissions. What this graph makes clear is one of the points that I mentioned at the beginning, which is that it's actually the local Nigerian operators that on a per unit basis tend to produce more emissions. So on the right-hand side of the graph, you can see Total, Shell, and some of the other major companies who, in terms of the ratio of how much they produce relative to their production, actually perform better than some of the smaller Nigerian companies. And one of the things we'll be looking to do in the future is to do some more work looking at the reasons for which that may be the case. But again, here, I think the important thing to mention is that there is a lot of variation among different companies and their respective environmental emissions. So what we then did is constructed an index. And as I say, the methodology and all the calculations for this are available online. And we scored each company ultimately out of 1, from lower scores to the left and the higher scores to the right. And I think just to reiterate here that the index is relative. So this looks at the performance according to our calculations of companies compared with each other. But as I said at the beginning, I think one of the key things we would emphasize is that overall, the Nigerian industry, according to the data we looked at, does not compare favorably with other oil industries around the world. So just to bear that in mind. And as you can see here, there is a range of scores, and some companies obviously score more highly on some indicators and some on other. We go into quite a lot of detail about the various indicators in the full report. And of course, I do urge you to go away and have a read of that, where we discuss all of these indicators in more detail. So in terms of where next, what do we want to do with this information? Well, I think as an organization, as SDN, we're clear that we feel industry needs to do more, as well as government and others. And there are compelling social, business, and political reasons for this. Most obviously, the local environmental damage, the legacy of many decades of environmental emissions in Nigeria is a lot of local discontent at the impact of the industry. This also means that there are license to operate risks for companies operating in Nigeria, relating to things like community relations. And we suspect increasingly relating to the environmental, social, and governance concerns that financial and other investors will bear in mind as they sort of look at who to invest in future. And then, of course, there are climate change commitments. Nigeria is a signatory to the Paris Accords. The world is trying to do its best to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as we said, there is a significant impact from gas flaring in particular on these targets for Nigeria. Furthermore, the federal government, the Nigerian federal government, has made clear its plans to expand the industry. It's intending to increase production from roughly 2 million barrels a day at the moment to roughly 3 million barrels a day in the near future, both as a result of increased exploration and production in the Niger Delta, but also in the Lake Chad Basin in the northeast. And we think there is potential for harm if the same mistakes which have been made in the Niger Delta are repeated elsewhere in Nigeria. So how do we bring about that change? Well, as I said at the beginning, our goal is shared value. And for us, that really means the first step is to establish the scale of the problem. Everybody has an interest in reducing emissions, and this is key to supporting everyone's work. I mean, it's key to understand the problem. And that's why we've tried to look at the emissions in a little bit more detail as part of this work. We do know the causes are very complex. Calvin has mentioned sabotage or third-party interference, which is a very, very important issue to take into account in any discussion of the environmental challenges of Nigerian oil. And we think that one thing would help with that is more data. Some companies already publish their own oil spill data. We commend that, and we would like to see all companies do that. We think that would be an important first step to allowing mutual accountability and to build trust among all involved, seeking to understand and obviously act on our understanding of the challenges in the Niger Delta. As I mentioned a couple of times, this is something we intend to do over the next 12 months, is to look in more detail at what explains the difference performance. I've mentioned a couple of dynamics relating to the size of companies and also their location geographically of oil spills. And we'll be looking in more detail where we can at what the reasons for those differences may be. And then finally, I suppose, if oil and gas is part of the problem in terms of the ultimate source of those emissions, then it must be part of the solution. And so that's why, as Calvin said, we undertook quite an extensive process of engagement with the companies, or some of the companies mentioned in this report, because we're keen to have that constructive, collaborative discussion on how all stakeholders can work together to address some of the issues that we discussed in this report. So at that point, I'll leave it there. I hope I haven't gone on for too long now. I think we're on time. So thank you very much. I will hand back over to Calvin, who will now facilitate our sort of response to questions which have been raised.
Perfect timing, Kevin. Thank you. Just quickly to remind everyone, we've already got some really good questions that have come in already, which I've taken note of. So please use the chat box to add your questions. Again, if you drop off at any point and rejoin, can't hear us, hit the join audio button. You should be able to hear us again. One thing, Kevin, I thought I would just add, as you didn't have the opportunity to mention it, and I haven't seen a question on it yet. We've noted that the total volume of oil spilled for 2018 is 25,000 barrels of oil, thereabouts. And you might have noticed, for instance, you'll see in the total volume spilled by state that Akwa Ibom was next to zero. Yet it is the largest oil producing state, although all of that's almost exclusively offshore. And there are certainly issues in trying to capture accurately the total volume of oil spills. There are many technical challenges, especially once it comes to offshore. So we recognise that 25,000 barrels is the minimum figure, really, just to make you aware of that. So Kevin and Jesse, I'll just kind of throw the questions out at both of you, and you can decide who would like to respond first. But there's some really good questions already. I think a lot of things that have kind of come up in our discussions as well as we've developed the index. So the first one is about causes. So how responsible, for example, are Shell or SPDC in this case for these spills versus being a victim of bunkering and theft?
So I'll just say something quickly on that. Thank you for that question. This is, of course, one of the very contentious topics in any discussion of Nigerian oil. In terms of how we've attributed causality, the short answer is we haven't. We've used the attribution of the data from Nigeria's oil spill monitor, and the data or the sort of attribution for that comes from the joint investigation visit, which is the, as the name implies, visit to oil spill sites, which is conducted, led by NOSDRA, to determine the party responsible for a spill. Now, as those of you who have worked on these topics will know, this is, as I say, a very contentious issue. And one of the things we've included in our annex is we've also broken down the volume of oil spilled by each company by what's attributed in the data as sabotage, and basically by other causes. And this shows, and the companies say this, and they're correct to do so according to the data available, that roughly 3/4 of spills are caused by bunkering or theft. I think the point of this report really is to seek to understand in absolute terms the emissions for 2018. And in future, we'll be looking to incorporate further analysis based on that breakdown of causality. I just cut out there. Further analysis of that breakdown according to causality attributed by the regulators.
Great, thank you, Kevin. I think on a similar, because we've got the same question again, but also saying, did we investigate the main causes of oil spills and gas flaring? I don't know if perhaps you or Jesse might just want to comment on that. I know the answer is no, that that wasn't the scope of the report to look at the cause of gas flaring, but we might just want to make a couple of comments on some of the reasons behind gas flaring.
Jesse, would you like to jump in on
that? Yes, I'll do that. The report we specifically looked at the volumes of emissions, so oil spills and gas flaring, but not on the various causes. And just as Kevin has gone ahead to explain the various things that could happen with oil spills. But for gas, what we know for gas, the cost of gas could be lots of issues, maybe operational flare, it could just be continuous flaring in some cases, but the report did not.
Sorry, Jesse, we haven't got a very good connection.
To look at the various causes or reasons why companies flare gas, but over the years, there's been a lot of reasons for that, but we didn't look at it specifically.
Sure, thank you. Hopefully you caught most of that from Jesse. And I think the big
what
point to
I'm
make...
trying to say is that
Yeah.
the report did look at the direct gas flaring. What we looked at was massive volume, but we all know that
Sorry, everyone, we haven't got a great connection with Jesse there. I think another sort of the general point to make as well is we know that a lot more needs to be done at a national level to look at how you can create an enabling environment for the use of gas, or legislating to ensure there's re-injection, or, as I say, creating an environment that they can be commercialized, used for energy production and so on. Kevin, do you want to say any more on that?
Sure, yes. I mean, gas flaring is another issue which people have been concerned about in Nigeria and also in other parts of the world. It's become a big issue in the southern part of the United States, of the rise of shale there as well. And it's principally a result of the fact that gas is much less commercially valuable than oil. So the incentive is for companies to produce the oil and flare the gas if there is no means to off-take it. And that generally means either significant pipeline infrastructure for it to be taken away either for export or used in power generation, or if it can't be used at source, for example, for local power generation, or perhaps compressed and bottled. One of the big initiatives that Nigeria is trying to get up and running this year is something called the Nigerian Gas Flare Commercialization Plan. And that involves selling title to gas flared from individual flare sites in order that it may be used at a sort of hyper-local level. I think developments in here are very promising, and we'll look to see what happens with that. There is more discussion of this in the report. Kevin, if you think I should say any more, I'm happy to do so, or we can move on.
I think that's fine. Thank you very much. If anyone wants any further sort of detail on that, please put it in the chat box. A point from Nicholas here saying that it would be good to put oil spillage in historical perspective. So, for example, looking at the trend over the past 5 years. Kevin, perhaps you'd just like to comment on the technical feasibility and challenges in doing some of that, or your perspective on that.
Thank you, and thank you for the question, Nicholas. The short answer is yes, I agree. We intend to try and do this. As you can imagine, there's a lot of quite complex work has gone into this. So at the moment, we're not able to say what is the trend that's emerging over the last 5 years or so, but we hope to try and do so. I think, to pick up on the point we've made a couple of times already, the data is really a challenge here. So Calvin mentioned that we cite NOSDA's figure of about 25,000 barrels spilled in 2018, and that's the official environmental regulator. But if you look at other reports, for example, the Department of Petroleum Resources, they have some, there's a very big discrepancy with other figures. So that's one of the sort of key challenges to try and consider. But yes, we will be trying to do that in future work to put it in perspective. There's a number of commentary that is provided by people, for example, on trends in bunkering and oil theft, and how that may or may not be impacted by the oil price. Now, that, of course, is significant this year in terms of the crash that's taken place over the last 6 months. And because bunkering is a very important activity in the context of trying to understand these types of issues, it's significant. So we will try and look at that in future work.
Thanks, Kevin. I think just because it's on this similar topic around volumes of oil spills, data, and the challenges, Mike has mentioned the importance of triangulating data. So for the 2011 Agoniand UNEP report, it looked at data from regulators, operators, and also communities, which says produce data with a high level of confidence. So I think that's a really valuable point, and something for us to consider for future is whether we try and triangulate different sources. I know that we tried to stick to establish single sources for each of the variables so that we could have consistency in the comparative data. But I don't know, Kevin, if you want to say any more about that.
Not immediately. I think that is an important point, and the level of confidence in data is obviously very significant for any kind of research. We did a lot of desk research initially, looking at the various different sources of data available, and for this report, these are spelled out, and how we sort of standardized and treated the data in the methodology, which is a separate document we will be publishing. We have very simply used Nigerian environmental regulator data for the emissions. So that's from the oil spill monitor and the gas flare tracker. I should add, in the interest of full disclosure, that we were involved in the technical development of those tools. But the data on oil spills, as I said previously, comes from the joint investigation visit carried out on the ground. And the data on gas flaring comes from it's via an American, actually, weather satellite, and the program uses basically infers gas flare volumes from satellite observations. For oil production volumes, we used data from the Department of Petroleum Resources, which is the Nigerian oil industry business regulator. So we tried to just use data that's in the public domain, and we've been consistent in how we've used that. We will look at the possibility of trying to triangulate other sources in future.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. That's great. One quick point here, just from Patrick, asking if we'll be able to share the reports, and just to reiterate, yes, after the webinar today, we'll be sharing links to the video, slides, a report, and briefing paper, so you'll be able to go into the findings and the data in detail. Here's another good, interesting question, Kevin, which I know that we haven't been able to do, but perhaps between you and Jesse, you might be able to make some comments on this. Whether the full report was able to look at the effects of these spillages on community economic activities and livelihoods.
Sorry, I was just unmuting myself there. Jesse, how's your connection? Would you be able to?
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Let me answer that one.
Go for it, Jesse. And if we have a problem with your connection, I'll mute you. But just try and go ahead. Hopefully, it'll work better this time.
Yes. We did not. We specifically looked at the spillages or the emissions from the oil company perspective. We didn't go into looking at its effect on livelihood of the communities that are impacted, which over the years there have been lots of discussions on the impact and the effects that the oil industry have had on livelihoods of communities. But this report did not seem to go ahead to capture that, but it's something of quite of an impact of oil spills on livelihood and all that. But for this one specifically, we didn't go into details to look at the impact of oil production on livelihoods of communities.
Sure, thank you, Jesse. And I think when we set out to conduct this research, we realised, the limits of what it would be possible for us to do, and we set ourselves a target of trying to understand the figures in the first instance. Understanding that impact is an extremely complex thing to look at. Obviously, I think as Kevin and I have discussed on many occasions, it doesn't take many litres of crude oil to completely destroy a community's water source. So we appreciate that, it's not just a question of the scale and size of spills, it's the number of them, where they take place, and so on. And this is our the 2018 index is our first attempt to start to look at some of these questions. And we want to continually improve it and increase its sophistication, and so that we can start to look at some of these additional questions. Kevin and Jesse, next question from Michael Watts here is, do we have a sense of the order of magnitude of the data discrepancies and the reliability from the companies and regulators concerning the accuracy of the spill recovery data from the joint investigation process? Now that's, we could have a very long discussion about that, but maybe pull out some key points you'd like to say into response to that.
Jesse, would you like to go first, and I'll follow up?
Yes. So during the research, what we've seen is that, okay, not all oil companies put out their data. So just a few of the majors who put out their data in public domain. And also we saw reports from data from DPR and NMPC, but we decided to stick with NOSDRA's data, which is the environmental regulator. But what we noticed is that the data from the other government agencies were a bit far apart. So in some cases, while NOSDRA data gave a figure of 25,000 liters, some was lower and some was higher, but we decided to stick with NOSDRA's figure. But the thing is this: the joint investigation visit is the sole process for identifying the cause of a spill and the volume of spill or volume of oil spilled. So we relied on that information for us to get the data, since it's something that all the parties try to stick on it rather than trying to generate some other data to query that. So that's the data we stuck with. Kevin,
Thanks, Jesse.
uh,
Yeah, Jesse, maybe I'll add a couple of points in response to that. So, I mean, maybe some specific examples are, so as Jesse mentioned, the Nostra data for 2018 says 25,000 barrels. And the DPR data for the same year says something in the region of 75,000 barrels. So that's 3 times more than the Nostra data. If you were to look at Shell's own reporting, SPDC, I can't remember the figure, but they report a slightly higher amount than Nostra's data, you know, maybe in the region of sort of 10 to 50% more. I can't quite recall. So those are the kind of discrepancies you see there. I think that there are also, though, if we come back to the challenge of estimating spill volumes, for instance, offshore, you will see in the data often a nominal figure put in against a spill record for offshore, because of the challenges that there are, either due to sort of financial constraints and technical constraints to measure these offshore. You'll see maybe like 1 barrel of oil, and we know that it could be many, many, many times more than that. So there is the potential for there to be quite large discrepancies in the data. Kevin, do you want to say any more?
Just briefly, yes, thank you. To reiterate the point that measuring oil spill volumes is not an exact science. And another example of where this is very tricky is onshore. And in the Niger Delta, as the name implies, is the delta of the River Niger. And the whole area is crisscrossed by rivers and creeks. And the point being here that if you have a spill near a flowing water source, then obviously some of that oil is carried downstream. And that introduces some fairly obvious difficulties for how you are measuring the volume of oil spilt. And then that impacts upon the previous question of, you know, what is the impact on local communities? There are a lot of challenges related to this. If I may put a shameless plug in for another piece of research we recently published, which relates to the compensation process for oil spills. We can perhaps share that link separately at some point. That includes further detail on these types of challenges. I think I'll leave it at that for this question.
Great, thank you, Kevin. So some good questions here from Laurel at Oxfam asking how IOCs, International Oil Company, spill emission rates in Nigeria compared to rates by these same companies in other countries, whether we can answer that. Also asking that in our conversations with regulators and operators, has concern or mention of Nigeria joining the Global Methane Alliance come up? And will that change any behaviours? Kevin, do you want to go first on those couple of points?
Sure. So IOCs compared with other countries, if I sort of made mention of this at the beginning in terms of the overall industry, based on the analysis we've conducted, with the caveat that I mentioned that we were comparing 2018 Nigeria data with International Oil and Gas Producer Association's 2017 data, the Nigerian industry is significantly worse compared with other countries, or rather with other regional industries. So we looked at Nigeria versus African average versus the global average. I don't know is the answer in terms of how that breaks down for IOCs. That would be that was beyond the scope of this research, but it would be a very interesting research topic. The question there, as always, would be getting disaggregated data by country, by company. But that's something perhaps we can follow up on after this call. In terms of the Global Methane Alliance, we know this is a very important issue. Methane is a significantly more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and you can't see it. I think I'm right in saying that you can only see it using infrared, and it's a big issue in general in terms of oil and gas, because there is reported to be significant leakage from pipeline and other infrastructure. We haven't considered that as part of this research, although we did note in the report that it's a potentially significant emission from the industry. So I think that's something that we will basically be looking to look into further.
Great, thank you. Here's a quick question here. Kevin, I don't know if we have the numbers right to hand, but we are asked, considering that a minimum of 25,000 barrels of oil was spilled in 2018, do we have info on how much was recovered from the environment? The short answer is yes, according to the joint investigation visit forms. But I don't know, Kevin, are we able to quote that figure?
It is in the report. Unfortunately, I don't have it to hand. So without leaving the presentation, I'm not able to find it. It is in the report. I guess just with the caveat that noting the points made previously regarding the difficulty of assessing these volumes. But yes, we do have that figure in the report.
Yeah, great, thank you. And we'll find that and try and quote it if we can before the end of the webinar, though we might be coming to the end. Certainly, if there are further questions, comments from anyone, please do get them into the chat box. I think we've got one further. I see we've also been asked if we can share any reports on impact on livelihoods. Nicholas will make a note of that and come back to you and have a think about what we can share with you. So then a point from Solomon here is that DPR spill reporting forms emphasizes on the recovery in their form B, while Nostra doesn't really make room for recovery in their reporting form. Jesse, I wonder if you can comment on that. Maybe my understanding is wrong, but my understanding is that the Nostra joint investigation visit is looking at that data.
Yes. The Nostra form does look at the volume, does record the volume of spill from the JIV, and that's the figure we used in this report, even though at the moment I'm unable to lay my hands on the exact figure of oil spills recovered during the research. But the Nostra forms makes provision for volume of oil recovered during a JIV.
Yes, thank you. And sorry, Ned, I'd accidentally marked your comment as responded to. I was wrong. So very good and important question here from Ned that Kevin, you'll probably be best able to answer. So saying, have we been consistent in attributing oil spill volumes to NNPC? So he says, for example, for SPDC, are we putting the entire volume to SPDC, or are we doing it according to the joint venture? So 30% to Shell, 10% to Total, 5% to NOAC, 55% to NNPC for oil. He says he was wondering, as gas flaring is heavily on NNPC, but oil spills are not. So Kevin, I think this is probably one for you to answer in terms of how the attributions have been done.
Sure. So thank you for that. Good. And as Calvin says, important question. Quite a technical in terms of oil spill volumes. So to reiterate what I said previously, the volumes are basically attributed by Nostra to oil companies. And that relates to the way in which the regulation describes that companies are responsible for the containment and recovery of oil spilled from facilities which they directly operate. So from, for example, their pipeline or a manifold or similar. In terms of gas, the regulations are basically say that the operator, so that's the company legally operating a given oil block, so an oil mining license or an oil mining lease or an oil prospecting license, is responsible for all gas flared in that oil block. But the operatorship tends to be split, and that's a function of the various legal structures such as joint ventures or production sharing contracts or whatever that are used in the financing of the oil industry. And so what we've done is we have effectively divided up the gas according to the equity split, the legal equity split, and hence the split in the operatorship for a given oil block, which is our understanding of the way that the regulations work. All the numbers are in the database. There is also a link to the regulations, and there is a complete breakdown of the numbers, of what the splits are, and therefore what the volumes attributed to each company is. And I just see your comment there as, I just wondered, as gas flaring is heavily on NNPC, but oil spills are not. So that is the reason why NNPC tends to be involved in basically, on paper, generally has a 55% equity share of many of the blocks which are operated, and so on paper it's responsible for that, according to the way in which we've attributed the oil and gas. I hope that answers the question. It is a little bit technical, but I'd be very happy to take that offline later if you'd like to discuss it more.
Thank you, Kevin. Right, where we have an important question from Gioma. Maybe we will come back to some of our recommendations, but you're saying, interesting to learn about the report, but what do we suggest is done about this? So maybe I'll just quickly go first on that. I think one of the reasons for us starting this piece of research and creating the index was to try and start from a better understanding of what's going on. And to have a set of comparative data which can then be discussed with the industry, with the regulator, and with others. I think Kevin's mentioned, one of the a big problem is the breakdown in trust now between communities, government, the industry, and we need to try and find ways that we can work together, because any solution to these complex problems of ongoing operational spills, but also sabotage and so on, is going to require us all to come together and to work on solutions. So I think that is one of the rationales behind this research in the first place. And we have a very good relationship with NOSTRA, the National Oil Spills Detection Response Agency, and we've been discussing with them how we might work together more in future to try and look at increased and renewed action on these problems. Another one of our recommendations is we say we still need more improved data, because it is a real problem. Even Kevin could tell you in detail about how long it's taken just to try and get some of the most fundamental data to be able to produce this analysis. It's not easy. But Kevin, I don't know if you want to go back to some of the recommendations or further thoughts from the report.
Thank you. Apologies if you can hear sirens in the background. I think, so as an organization, we are involved in a number of initiatives looking at, for example, the importance of generating livelihoods for alternative livelihoods for people currently involved in oil bunkering, which, there are very complex social and economic factors involved in why that is a very big, significant industry in the Niger Delta. And that's relevant to oil spills because that also leads to environmental emissions. As I mentioned previously, a majority in absolute terms of spills are are attributed to sabotage, and the oil companies will rightly identify that as a key factor. So there's a lot of different work that we do as an organization. I think in terms of this report, as Calvin mentioned, more data would certainly be one. Something that has been ongoing for many years now in the Nigerian National Assembly is the attempted passing of significant legislative reform with a number of key bills. We have done some work looking at the NOSDRA Amendment Bill. This would provide NOSDRA with increased powers to oversee sort of oil spill response, and that would be a positive step. And there are many legislators working towards that in the Nigerian National Assembly. And I think, the point about trust, I make no apologies for reiterating. There's been decades of social tension in or relating to the oil industry in Nigeria. And that's why, to go back to the very beginning of what we said, this is really an attempt to establish a shared understanding of the environmental emissions of the industry as a basis for a sensible discussion about the things that can be undertaken. I mean, gas flaring is another example. One of the concerns many people have is that there are roughly 30 million people living in the Niger Delta, sitting on top of enormous gas reserves in particular. Sometimes you'll hear Nigeria referred to as actually a gas province with oil deposits rather than the other way around. But there's very little access to electricity, certainly in rural areas. I mentioned the Nigerian gas flare commercialization plan. And if that can be implemented effectively, that really is a win-win for everyone, because that will provide increased access to electricity, which is a broader barrier to socioeconomic development. That will support economic development, and that will help reduce some of the impacts which reportedly are associated with the burning of methane, which is then converted into carbon dioxide for the local environment. There will, of course, still be issues relating to climate change linked to that. So I think I'll stop there. Perhaps Jesse has something further to add, but that's probably my contribution in brief on that point.
Jesse, would you like to say any more?
Nothing to add.
Okay, thank you. And so we've already gone past 3. Well, we'll go on for a few more minutes at least if you want to stay on the line, because there's just a few more comments here. I'll just quickly note to Solomon, you've had a couple of responses in the chat box about Nostra Form B capturing the estimated quantity of oil recovered. So I'll just leave you to look at that, because there seems to be a good discussion going on there about that. There is, and I'll just quickly come back to Ned, Kevin, who mentioned that the response you gave makes sense, but it does look strange, so it's probably worthy of a footnote in the report somewhere. That's probably something, I think Ned, we'll have a chat about that after the webinar and see if that's something we want to insert to the report, just to make a note of that. So thanks for that point. Okay, there's a question here from Christabel about, is this index report relevant to the cleanup exercise? And I guess that will be the Ogoniland cleanup being delivered to be delivered by HiPrep. Well, I think it obviously is relevant in terms of looking at the general context and looking at the ongoing performance of the industry, because we don't want to see ongoing oil spills resulting in the kind of environmental disaster that you see in Ogoniland. So I think absolutely, in terms of looking at ongoing performance and trying to prevent future oil spills, but also looking at the rate at which oil spills are being cleaned up, it's very much relevant in that sense. As I've said before, the 2018 report is really our starting point, and we've looked at oil spills and gas flaring in the first instance. We do have aspirations to look at wider aspects of performance. So we might look at for example, company policy and transparency on certain issues, to add in indicators around other aspects of performance as well. So I think it's just worthy noting that we don't necessarily just want to maintain what is a relatively narrow, although I think very important focus at the moment on oil spills and gas flares. Jesse, do you want to say anything else perhaps about relevance to the Ogoniland cleanup?
Just to buttress the points you've raised, yes, if the Ogoniland, the high pleb cleanup at the moment is focused on Ogoni area, but this report just goes ahead to show that oil spill is still an issue in Nigeria, and there needs to be a concerted effort by all relevant stakeholders to look at ways to reduce the amount of oil being spilled into the environment, and also to for HyPrep to take it as a point to do the right thing, what they're doing now, so that it could be as a model to extend to other impacted communities and areas in the Niger Delta to clean up the whole place, so that Nigeria will get to be a cleaner and healthier Niger Delta.
Thanks, Jesse. And I think Mike in the comments has also made a very relevant point that UNEP have recently documented a list of over 200 new oil spills to investigate in Ogoniland. So some of the oil spills that will be being captured in the index will be spills in Ogoniland, which shows that the challenge of the cleanup in Ogoniland is not just about historic oil spill pollution, but also ongoing and recent oil spills. Thanks very much for that, Mike. Kevin, I'll throw you, or Jesse. I think that the last additional comment that we have here is an interesting one from Patrick, saying, how are the international oil companies addressing human rights violations and abuses in the Niger Delta region? Well, I would say, obviously, our environmental performance index that we're discussing today is we're not necessarily looking at wider human rights issues. I think, obviously, what we've documented for the 2018 report is that oil spills and gas flaring are still extensive. We know that they result in loss of livelihoods. There's a study that was released, I think, in 2018, 2017, suggesting that that for mothers who had conceived and had lived within, I think, a 1 kilometer radius of an oil spill, that their children were twice as likely to die in their first year of life than others. So I think we've talked about the numbers and the facts of oil spills and gas flares, but there is a very real and serious human impact in the Niger Delta, which is ongoing, and that's all the more reason that this should be an urgent issue to address. Kevin, Jesse, do you want to say anything more on that? I mean, that's a big issue that's brought up there.
I will. Sorry, I was just waiting to see if Jesse was going to jump in. I think, well, it is a very big issue. I mean, in terms of this report, as Calvin said, no, the answer is we were looking at the environmental emissions. Of course, they have a human rights impact, not least in terms of the rights of Nigerians to a healthy environment. We've done a lot of other research, so I think apologies if this sounds like a cop-out, but I think what I would do is encourage listeners to have a look at our website, where we've discussed a number of the sort of issues relating to human rights in the context of the oil industry. We've got a very wide range of reports looking at related issues.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. And I think it is important for us to look at human rights issues in the Niger Delta and the importance of international company action, equally the action of all stakeholders. So the problems of operations of oil companies is certainly an issue, but we also know there are wider issues which are complex and interlinked. For instance, of sabotage, oil theft, and all of these problems. So it is going to take a wide stakeholder response of government, the industry, civil society, and so on to resolve many of these complex problems. But on that serious note, I don't think there are any more comments. My apologies. We did have a flood of comments coming at points, so if I have missed anything, my apologies to you. But I believe you have SDN's contact email address, info@stakeholderdemocracy. So you're very welcome to contact us, and we're very happy to answer your questions. Kevin or Jesse, do you have anything to add before we wrap up?
No, not beyond saying I know we've gone a little bit over time, but thank you very much to everyone for joining. We had more than 50 people take part today, which is great. We, as Calvin said, are always keen to talk to people interested in working on these and related issues. So please do get in touch with us. Our communications officer, Daniel Turkelson, has just put our email address in the chat box, and it's also in the report. So thank you again for joining, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation and working with you where we're able to do so.
Yeah, and likewise from me, I appreciate everyone joining and taking the time to participate in the webinar. Like I said, we are looking to, and we are continuing to actively engage with the regulator, Nostra, with the industry, with civil society. If this is a piece of work that you're interested in seeing how you might be able to collaborate with SDN in the future, we would absolutely be very happy to hear from you. Jesse, sorry, did you have anything to add before we wrap up?
What I wanted to say is thank you very much for joining us for this launch. This is a first step towards bringing every stakeholder to the same board to discuss the issues about environmental pollution in the Niger Delta. There are obviously some data challenges for us in putting up this report together, but this is our first instance. Hopefully, we'll look out for you for your contributions and everything to make sure that the next report on this will be a lot better than what we put out today. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you so much, Jesse. So I think, as Daniel said in the comments, we'll finish now, but we won't close the Zoom room for about 5 minutes, so that if there's anything you wanted to copy and paste from the chat room and so on, you're welcome to do so. As we've mentioned, we'll be emailing with links to the videos, slides, and so on after the event as well. So thank you, and goodbye, everyone.